James Westwood's pickup rumbled along the winding road that led into Maple Creek Valley, the early morning mist clinging to the trees like a ghostly shroud. His worn cowboy hat shielded his face, but the hard set of his jaw and the slight tension in his shoulders betrayed the thoughts racing through his mind. The valley unfolded before him, a serene patchwork of green pastures and rolling hills. Maple Creek was a small town nestled deep in the heart of the countryside, its population barely exceeding 1,000. It was the kind of place where people waved to one another from their porches and children rode bikes down the middle of the street without fear. For James, it was a refuge, a place to start over. Or so he told himself when he arrived 5 years ago. The townsfolk knew James as the quiet rancher who kept to himself on the old Miller property, a sprawling 50-acre ranch he'd purchased after its previous owner passed away. He rarely attended town events, never lingered after church on Sundays, and spoke only when spoken to. Despite his reserved demeanor, his presence carried a weight that the locals couldn't quite explain. James parked his truck near the general store and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He adjusted his hat and headed inside. "Morning, Mr. Westwood," Emma Cartwright greeted him from behind the counter. The store's proprietor, a sprightly woman in her late 50s, had taken it upon herself to be the valley's unofficial news hub. "Morning, Emma," James replied, his voice low and measured. He grabbed a bag of feed and placed it on the counter. Emma glanced at him as she rang up his purchase. "Did you hear about the new folks settling up near the creek? A whole group of them came in with trucks and equipment last night. Sheriff Langley said they've got permits for some kind of construction project." James nodded noncommittally, but his mind was already working. He'd noticed the trucks passing through town the evening before, their drivers unfamiliar, their cargo suspiciously nondescript. That evening, James stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, sipping black coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. From his vantage point, he could see the distant lights of the construction site Emma had mentioned. He set his coffee down and walked inside, locking the door behind him. In the back room, James activated a hidden switch beneath his desk. A concealed panel slid open, revealing an array of surveillance monitors and equipment. Footage from hidden cameras he'd installed around the valley filled the screens, showing angles of the new construction site, the roads leading into town, and several other key locations. For years, James had been preparing for something like this. His quiet life in Maple Creek wasn't just a retreat. It was a calculated decision to live in a place that would eventually attract attention from the wrong kind of people. The Iron Crows. James clenched his jaw at the thought of the criminal organization that had destroyed his life. Years ago, while working as a federal investigator, he had gone undercover to expose their operations. But his cover had been blown, and the resulting fallout had cost him everything: his family, his career, and his faith in the system. Since then, he dedicated himself to one mission: dismantling the Iron Crows from the shadows. He'd chosen Maple Creek because its geography and remoteness made it an ideal location for a criminal enterprise to set up shop. And if they did, James would be ready. The next morning, James drove into town, parking near Sarah's Diner. The diner was the social heart of Maple Creek, where locals gathered to swap stories over coffee and pie. As James walked in, the chatter died down slightly, the regulars acknowledging him with polite nods. "Morning, James," Sarah Whitaker said as she poured coffee for a customer. The diner's owner was a sharp-witted woman in her early 60s, whose kindness masked a no-nonsense attitude. "Morning, Sarah," James replied, taking a seat by the window. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed the sheriff's patrol car pulling into the lot. Sheriff Bill Langley stepped out, his hat tilted at a familiar angle. Langley was a good man, steady and fair, but he was no match for what James suspected was coming. Langley entered the diner and sat across from James without waiting for an invitation. "Morning, Westwood. You've been keeping an eye on the new construction?" James set down his mug, saw the trucks pass through. "What's the word?" Langley sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Officially, they're building a storage facility. But something doesn't sit right with me. Too much equipment for a storage shed, and the permits came through awfully quick." James nodded, his mind already racing. "You need to keep an eye on them." Langley chuckled humorlessly. "Funny, I was going to say the same to you. Folks around here trust you, James, even if you don't talk much. They'd follow your lead if things got rough. James didn't respond, but he appreciated Langley's insight. The sheriff had always seen through his quiet facade, even if he didn't know the full extent of James's past. That night, James's suspicions were confirmed. Reviewing his surveillance footage, he spotted armed guards patrolling the construction site. The Iron Crows weren't just building a storage facility, they were setting up a base of operations. James leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. The valley was about to change, and he would make sure it changed on his terms. For years, he'd been waiting, watching, and preparing. Now, it was time to act. The hum of the early morning wind swept through Maple Creek Valley as James Westwood stood atop a ridge, his binoculars trained on the so-called construction site near the creek. The scene below confirmed his worst suspicions. Men in tactical gear patrolled the perimeter, their movements too calculated for mere security guards. They were Iron Crows. He could see it in their posture, the way they carried their weapons, and the deliberate scanning of their surroundings. James lowered the binoculars, his jaw tightening. For 5 years, Maple Creek had been a haven, a place where he could heal and plan. Now, the valley's tranquility was threatened, and James knew it was only a matter of time before the Iron Crows began to extend their reach. By the time James arrived in town later that morning, Maple Creek was already buzzing. At Sarah's diner, the usual crowd had gathered, but the conversations carried an undertone of unease. "I'm telling you," Paul Everett, the local mechanic, said, his voice rising above the murmur of the room. "They're not here to build a storage facility. You don't need armed guards for storage." Anna Harper, the town schoolteacher, shook her head. "But what can we do? They have permits. Everything looks legal on paper." James stepped into the diner and took his usual seat by the window. Sarah Whitaker approached with a steaming mug of coffee. "Heard anything new?" she asked quietly, her voice just for him. "Not yet," James replied, "but we need to stay alert." The sheriff's patrol car pulled into the lot moments later. Sheriff Bill Langley entered the diner, his expression grim as he surveyed the room. He walked directly to James and slid into the seat across from him. "We need to talk," Langley said. James nodded. "Let's go." The two men stepped outside, away from prying ears. Langley crossed his arms, leaning against his car. "I've been keeping an eye on those guys near the creek. Had one of my deputies drive by yesterday. He didn't like what he saw. Lots of men, lots of equipment, and no sign of actual construction. They're setting up shop," James said evenly. "And if we don't act soon, they'll own this valley." Langley looked at James for a long moment. "You know more about this than you're letting on." James met the sheriff's gaze. "I've dealt with their kind before. If you give them an inch, they'll take everything. The town's businesses, the land, the people, they'll make it all theirs." Langley exhaled sharply. "So what do we do?" "First we watch," James said. "No one makes a move unless it's necessary. But we need to start documenting everything: license plates, delivery schedules, movements. Build a case they can't refute." Langley nodded slowly. "You're the quiet type, Westwood, but you don't seem like the kind of man who's ever been a bystander. Why do I feel like you've done this before?" James didn't answer, instead focusing on the distant construction site. "Let's just say I know how they think." That afternoon, James visited Paul Everett's garage. The mechanic was under a truck, his grease-streaked boots sticking out from underneath. "Paul," James called. The mechanic rolled out, squinting up at him. "What's up, Westwood?" "I need your help." Paul stood, wiping his hands on a rag.
"With what?"
"Keeping an eye on those guys near the creek. I need someone who knows engines to watch what they're bringing in. Trucks, machinery, anything out of the ordinary." Paul tilted his head, curious. "Why me?" "Because you're smart and you're trusted," James said simply. "And because they won't see you coming." Paul considered this for a moment, then nodded. "All right. What do you need me to do?" James laid out a plan, and by the time he left the garage, Paul was fully on board. His next stop was the schoolhouse, where Anna Harper was locking up for the day. "Mr. Westwood," she greeted him, surprised. "Miss Harper," James replied. "I need a favor." Anna frowned, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "What kind of favor?" I need someone who can help organize information discreetly. You've got an eye for detail, and the town trusts you. If you're willing, I'll teach you what to look for." Anna hesitated, but finally nodded. "If it's for the good of the valley, I'll do what I can." James spent the next few days quietly training Paul and Anna, showing them how to observe without being noticed, how to document without leaving a trail, and how to recognize patterns in the Iron Crow's activities. Sheriff Langley provided additional support, instructing his deputies to gather intelligence without tipping off the syndicate. As the days passed, the town's unease grew. Several businesses reported unusual visits from men in suits, asking about property sales. Anna confided in James that 2 men had come to the school, asking questions about the building's ownership and funding. One evening, James sat on his porch, reviewing the notes and photos Paul and Anna had collected. The Iron Crows were moving faster than he'd anticipated, and their tactics were escalating. The next morning, James met Sheriff Langley at the diner. "They're pushing harder," Langley said grimly. James nodded. "We need to stay ahead of them. They're testing the waters, trying to see how much resistance they'll face. Do you think they'll back off?" James shook his head. "No, not unless we make it clear that this valley isn't an easy target." As James spoke, a sleek black SUV pulled into the diner's parking lot. 2 men in sharp suits stepped out, their movements deliberate as they entered the diner. The room fell silent as the men surveyed the patrons. One of them approached Sarah at the counter. "We'd like to speak with the owner," he said smoothly. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You're looking at her. What do you want?" "We represent an organization interested in investing in this town," the man said, flashing a toothy smile. "We'd like to discuss a few opportunities." "I'm not selling," Sarah said flatly. The man's smile didn't falter, but his tone hardened. "Perhaps you should reconsider. We can be very persuasive." Before Sarah could respond, James stood and approached the counter. "The lady said she's not interested." The man turned to James, sizing him up. "And who are you?" "Just someone who doesn't like pushy salesmen," James replied evenly. The man's eyes narrowed, but after a tense moment, he nodded. "We'll be in touch." As the men left, the room exhaled collectively. Sarah turned to James. "You've got a way of stirring the pot, Westwood." James shrugged. "Sometimes the pot needs stirring." Outside, he watched the SUV drive away, his mind already working on the next steps. The Iron Crows were probing the valley's defenses, but they had no idea what they were up against. James was done watching from the sidelines. The morning air carried the crisp scent of pine as James Westwood stood on a bluff overlooking Maple Creek Valley. He adjusted the focus on his binoculars, scanning the Iron Crow's construction site below. Over the past week, their activity had doubled. More equipment, more men, and more vehicles were coming and going at odd hours. James lowered the binoculars and muttered to himself, "They're building more than just a foothold." Back at his ranch, James spread a map of the valley across his dining table. He'd marked key areas, the creek, the main roads, and the diner, along with Paul Everett's garage and Anna Harper's school. Small red dots indicated where he'd placed hidden cameras, while blue circles showed strategic vantage points for surveillance. Paul and Anna arrived at the ranch a short while later, Paul carrying a toolbox and Anna clutching a notebook. Sheriff Langley followed, tipping his hat as he entered. "All right," James began, gesturing to the map. "We're stepping things up. The Iron Crows are settling in faster than I expected. If we don't act now, they'll entrench themselves." Langley crossed his arms. "You have a plan?" James nodded. "We need to monitor everything they do. Movements, deliveries, even the people they bring in. The more we document, the stronger our case will be." Paul raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about turning this valley into one big surveillance net." "Exactly," James said. "But it has to be subtle. If they catch wind of what we're doing, they'll shut it down before we can gather enough evidence." Anna stepped forward, her voice steady. "What do you need from us?" James tapped the map. "Paul, you'll focus on the roads. Every vehicle that comes through the valley passes your garage. Start noting license plates and cargo. Don't draw attention to yourself. Just act like you're doing routine checks for customers." Paul nodded. "Got it." James turned to Anna. "You'll be the record keeper. Every note, every photo, Every observation goes through you. Keep it secure and organized. Anna looked determined. Consider it done. Langley frowned. And what about me? You'll coordinate with your deputies, James replied. Make sure they're keeping an eye out without engaging. If we show our hand too soon, they'll clamp down. Langley sighed. All right, Westwood. Let's see where this goes. Over the next few days, the plan took shape. James worked with Paul to install discrete cameras near the main roads, hidden inside old fence posts and hollowed-out tree trunks. Anna transformed her modest home into a makeshift command center where she meticulously cataloged every scrap of information. Sheriff Langley ensured his deputies knew how to document suspicious activities without drawing attention. He also quietly enlisted the help of local farmers, who agreed to watch the creek and report anything unusual. The townspeople began noticing subtle changes. Paul lingered longer at his garage, tinkering with vehicles that didn't seem to need fixing. Anna started carrying a satchel everywhere, jotting down notes as she walked through town. Even Sarah Whitaker at the diner seemed more alert, listening carefully to the conversations of strangers. James, meanwhile, expanded his network of hidden cameras, working late into the night to cover key locations. His years of experience as a federal investigator served him well. Every camera placement was calculated, every angle deliberate. One evening, as James reviewed the day's footage, he noticed something unusual. A convoy of 3 unmarked vans had arrived at the construction site, their rear doors tightly secured with heavy locks. Men in black jackets unloaded crates and carried them into a newly constructed building. James zoomed in, snapping screenshots and noting the time. He didn't need to open the crates to know they contained contraband, likely weapons or drugs. He picked up his radio and called Langley. Sheriff, we've got a delivery. 3 vans, black, no plates. You might want to send someone to keep an eye on the roads tonight. Langley's voice crackled over the line. Understood. I'll send Turner to the West Road and Parsons to the north. You think this is their first big move? I'd bet on it, James replied. The next day, James gathered Paul, Anna, and Langley at his ranch to review the footage. This is the start of something bigger, James said, pointing to the crates on the screen. They're not just setting up shop, they're moving product. Once they establish a distribution route, it'll be nearly impossible to shut them down without a fight. Langley scowled. So, what do we do? We keep documenting, James said, but we also start preparing the town. Paul looked skeptical. Preparing for what? For when they push back, James replied. James's quiet determination began to spread through Maple Creek. He spoke with Sarah at the diner, asking her to discreetly gather information from customers who might know more about the Iron Crows. He visited Emma Cartwright at the general store, encouraging her to keep an eye on unusual purchases. Slowly but surely, the town became a web of quiet resistance. The Iron Crows, however, were not blind to the growing tension. One afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled up to Paul's garage. 2 men stepped out, their sharp suits at odds with the dust-covered trucks lining the road. Paul wiped his hands on a rag as the men approached. Can I help you? One of the men smiled thinly. We've heard good things about your shop. Figured we'd stop by and see for ourselves. Paul forced a grin. Well, you've come to the right place. What can I do for you? The men exchanged glances before one said, Just checking out the area. We might have some business for you in the future. Paul nodded, his heart pounding. Let me know. As the men drove away, Paul quickly jotted down their license plate and description, sending the information to Anna. That night, James met with Langley to discuss the encounter. They're testing us, Langley said, trying to figure out who's paying attention. James nodded. Let them look. They won't find anything, yet. Langley tilted his head. You seem awfully confident, Westwood. James's expression hardened. I've dealt with men like this before. They think they can intimidate their way into control. But this time, they've underestimated the people they're dealing with. Langley nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. Well, let's make sure it stays that way. By the end of the week, the town's resistance network was fully operational. James's cameras covered every major route, while Anna's meticulous records ensured no detail was overlooked. Paul's garage became a hub for monitoring road traffic, and Langley's deputies quietly strengthened their patrols. Maple Creek wasn't just a small town anymore. It was a fortress, its people united by a shared purpose. The Iron Crows had no idea what they were walking into. The quiet of Maple Creek was shattered one early morning by the sharp crack of gunfire. James Westwood bolted upright in bed, the sound cutting through the stillness of his ranch like a knife. He grabbed the pistol from his nightstand and moved swiftly to the window, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. A plume of smoke rose in the direction of Paul Everett's garage. James's heart sank. He grabbed his jacket, slipped the pistol into its holster, and sped toward town in his truck, the wheels kicking up gravel in his wake. The garage was a smoldering ruin when James arrived. Paul stood near the wreckage, his face streaked with soot, his hands trembling. "They torched it," Paul said, his voice hoarse. "Middle of the night. Didn't see who did it." Sheriff Langley was already on the scene, speaking with his deputies. James approached him, his expression grim. "They're sending a message," Langley said, shaking his head. "This wasn't random. They know we're watching." James surveyed the damage. The fire had consumed most of the garage, but Paul's hidden logbooks and surveillance footage were safe, thanks to the precautionary measures James had insisted on. "Did anyone see anything?" James asked. "One of the neighbors said they heard trucks leaving just before the fire started," Langley replied. "No plates, no IDs. It's like they vanished into thin air." "They're not gone," James said. "They're waiting to see what we'll do next." The attack on the garage sent ripples of fear through the valley. At Sarah's diner, the usual chatter was replaced with hushed whispers as the townsfolk tried to make sense of what had happened. "They're getting bolder," Anna Harper said, her voice tinged with worry as she slid into the booth across from James. "If they can destroy Paul's garage, what's stopping them from targeting the school? Or the diner?" "Nothing," James said bluntly, "unless we make it clear that we're not backing down." "How do we do that?" Anna asked. James leaned forward, his voice low. "We stick to the plan. We document everything. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case becomes. They're trying to scare us into submission. We can't let that happen." The Iron Crows weren't done. Over the next few days, their tactics escalated. Anna found threatening letters slipped under the schoolhouse door, warning her to stop meddling in things that don't concern her. Sheriff Langley's deputies were followed by unmarked cars during their patrols, and one of the farmers who'd been helping with surveillance discovered his barn door smashed open, his livestock scattered. Each incident was calculated, designed to intimidate and sow discord. But instead of breaking the town's spirit, it hardened their resolve. James gathered Paul, Anna, Langley, and a few trusted allies at his ranch. "They're testing us," James said, pacing in front of the group, "trying to see how far they can push before we fold. But we're not going to fold. We're going to push back." Langley raised an eyebrow. "How do you suggest we do that?" James stopped pacing and faced them. "We turn their tactics against them. They think they're watching us, but we're watching them. We keep documenting, but we also start making noise, quietly. Let them know we're not afraid." Paul nodded, his jaw set. "I'm in. They already took my garage. What else can they take?" Anna chimed in. "Me too. If they think I'm going to stop teaching or helping this town, they're wrong." Langley sighed. "All right, Westwood. What's the plan?" That night, James and Paul worked together to install additional cameras near the Iron Crow's construction site. Hidden in nearby trees and disguised as natural fixtures, the cameras provided a clear view of the syndicate's operations. Meanwhile, Anna coordinated with Sarah to start spreading subtle messages through the town, encouraging residents to stay vigilant and report anything suspicious. Sheriff Langley increased his patrols, making sure his deputies were visible and present in key areas. The Iron Crows responded with more aggression. Late one evening, James discovered tire tracks leading up to his property. Someone had driven close enough to leave a message, a crude threat spray-painted on the side of his barn. "Stay out, old man." James stared at the message for a long moment before pulling out his phone. He snapped a photo and sent it to Langley. "They're getting personal," James said when Langley arrived the next morning. Langley nodded, his expression grim. "You worried?" "No," James said, his voice steady. "Just more proof of what we're dealing with." The breaking point came when the Iron Crows made their boldest move yet. Late one night, they blocked the main road leading into Maple Creek with 2 large trucks, effectively cutting off the town. Residents woke to find armed men patrolling the blockade, turning back anyone who tried to leave. Sheriff Langley received a call from the lead enforcer, a man who introduced himself as Carter Gage. "We've been patient, Sheriff," Gage said, his tone cold, "but your town's been meddling in our business. Time for that to stop." Langley relayed the message to James, who listened in silence before speaking. "They're overplaying their hand," James said. "Blocking the road is a direct threat. It's time we hit back." James gathered the townspeople at the diner that evening. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. "We're in a fight now," James said, his voice calm but firm. "They think they can scare us into submission. But Maple Creek isn't just any town. We're stronger than they realize." Paul stood, his voice ringing out. "They burned my garage, and I'm still here. They won't win." Anna followed. "They threatened my school, but I'm not backing down." Langley stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "We've got a plan, and we've got evidence. But we need everyone to stay strong. If we give in, they win." The townspeople nodded, their resolve solidifying. For years, Maple Creek had been a quiet, unassuming place. Now, it was a community united against a common enemy. The next morning, James and Langley led a small group to the roadblock. Carter Gage and his men watched from a distance as James stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Morning," James said, his tone casual. Gage smirked. "You've got some nerve showing up here." James didn't flinch. "You've got 2 choices. Pack up and leave, or stay and face the consequences." Gage laughed. "What consequences? You think your little town can stop us?" James's expression didn't waver. "You'd be surprised what a town like this can do." Behind him, Langley's deputies moved into position, their presence a silent statement of defiance. Gage's smirk faded. He gestured to his men, and the roadblock was removed. As the trucks drove off, James turned to Langley. "They'll be back." Langley nodded. "And we'll be ready." James looked out over the valley, the weight of the fight ahead pressing on his shoulders. The Iron Crows had struck, but Maple Creek had held its ground. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, James saw a glimmer of hope. The town was stronger than he dared to believe, and they were just getting started. Maple Creek Valley buzzed with quiet determination in the days following the removal of the Iron Crows roadblock. The residents had seen firsthand that their unity could withstand the syndicate's intimidation. But James Westwood knew that the Iron Crows wouldn't give up easily. Their temporary retreat was only the prelude to a larger, more calculated assault. James spent his mornings reviewing footage from the hidden cameras, his evenings quietly coordinating with Sheriff Langley and their trusted network. The valley's defenses were growing stronger, but James needed more than vigilance to win. He needed to take control of the narrative and shift the balance of power. One morning, Paul Everett arrived at James's ranch with news. "I followed one of their supply trucks," Paul said, leaning against his dusty pickup. "It headed out west, into the hills. There's an old logging road up there they're using to avoid the main routes." James studied the map spread across his dining table, marking the logging road. "Good work. We need to know where they're taking those supplies." Anna Harper joined them, her notebook in hand. "I've been organizing the reports from the townspeople," she said. "Some of them have noticed unmarked cars parked near their properties. It's subtle, but they're definitely watching us." James nodded. "They're looking for leverage, trying to figure out who they can intimidate." He looked at Anna. "Make sure everyone knows to stay alert. The more eyes we have on them, the better." That evening, James and Langley drove to the hills, following Paul's lead. The dirt road wound through dense forest, the overhanging branches creating a tunnel of shadows. When they reached a clearing, they parked and continued on foot, their boots crunching softly on the gravel path. Ahead, the trees opened to reveal a makeshift depot. Trucks were parked in neat rows, their cargo being unloaded by men in black jackets. James and Langley crouched behind a fallen log, observing the scene through binoculars. "They're moving a lot of equipment," Langley whispered. "Not just equipment," James replied, his voice low. "That's contraband," Guns, drugs, maybe worse. He adjusted the focus on his binoculars, zeroing in on one of the crates. See those markings? That's cartel property. Langley let out a low whistle. They're deeper in this than we thought. James pulled out a small camera and began taking pictures, documenting everything. We'll add this to the file. The more we have, the harder it'll be for them to deny when the time comes. Back in town, Sarah Whitaker's diner had become the de facto command center for the town's resistance. Locals came and went throughout the day, sharing observations and exchanging updates. Emma Cartwright, the general store owner, had taken it upon herself to distribute supplies to those involved in the effort, ensuring everyone had what they needed. I heard from one of my suppliers, Emma told Sarah over coffee. They've been approached by men asking about bulk orders, tools, chemicals, you name it. They're gearing up, Sarah said, her brow furrowed. Then so are we, Emma replied. James called a town meeting that evening. The diner was packed, the tension palpable as the residents gathered to hear the latest updates. They've escalated, James began, addressing the room. We've confirmed they're moving contraband through the valley. That means more pressure, more intimidation, and eventually, more violence. But we've also confirmed something else. They don't think we can stop them. He paused, letting the words sink in. They're wrong, James continued. We've already proven that Maple Creek is stronger than they expected. Now we're going to show them that we're not just watching. We're fighting back. And we're doing it smart. Sheriff Langley stepped forward. We've been documenting everything, license plates, shipments, threats. We're building a case that will stick. But we need everyone to stay sharp. Report anything unusual, no matter how small. It all matters. Paul Everett stood next. They think they can scare us by burning down a garage or blocking a road. But we're still here, and we're not going anywhere. The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Anna Harper spoke last, her voice clear and steady. This is our home, and we're not going to let them take it. As the meeting dispersed, James stayed behind with Langley, Paul, and Anna to finalize their next steps. We need to push harder, James said. If we can intercept one of their shipments or document a major delivery, it'll be enough to draw outside attention. Langley frowned. That's risky. If they catch us, they'll retaliate. They'll retaliate anyway, James replied. This is about control. If we let them dictate the terms, we've already lost. The opportunity came 2 nights later. Paul spotted a supply truck heading up the logging road toward the depot. He called James, who quickly rallied Langley and Anna. They followed the truck at a safe distance, their headlights off as they navigated the darkened road. When the truck stopped at the depot, James and Langley crept closer, hiding behind a stack of crates. Inside the truck, they could see rows of neatly packed boxes. Langley pried one open with a crowbar, revealing rows of assault rifles. Got him, James whispered, snapping photos with his camera. As they retreated, they noticed movement near the depot's perimeter. One of the guards had spotted something. Time to go, James said. The group moved quickly but quietly, slipping back into the shadows before the guards could pinpoint their location. The next day, the mood in Maple Creek was electric. The photos James and Langley had taken were clear, undeniable evidence of the Iron Crow's illegal activities. Anna worked tirelessly to organize the images and notes, creating a comprehensive dossier that Langley could share with state and federal authorities. But James knew that the Iron Crows wouldn't go down without a fight. We've drawn their attention, James said during a meeting with Langley and Paul. They'll come after us harder now. We need to be ready. Langley nodded. I'll double patrols. Make sure the deputies are on high alert. Paul grinned. Let them try. They'll learn real quick what this town is made of. That night, James sat on his porch, watching the valley. The lights of the Iron Crow's depot flickered in the distance, a stark reminder of the battle still ahead. But for the first time, James felt a surge of hope. Maple Creek was fighting back, and they were winning. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past week settling on his shoulders. The Iron Crows thought they could intimidate a small town into submission. Instead, they had awakened something far more powerful, a community united in purpose, willing to stand together against any threat. The tide was turning, and James Westwood was ready for whatever came next. The morning after James and his team documented the weapons shipment, the town of Maple Creek awoke to a stark change in the Iron Crow strategy. Overnight, their operations had grown more aggressive. Trucks roared through the valley, guards patrolled openly with rifles, and black SUVs loitered near key locations, visible reminders of the syndicate's presence. "They're done hiding," Sheriff Langley said, his tone grim as he met with James at the diner. "They know we're onto them, and they're doubling down." James sipped his coffee, his eyes distant but calculating. "That means they're scared. When people like them get desperate, they make mistakes. We just need to stay sharp and catch them in the act." The Iron Crow's desperation became evident later that day when a group of their enforcers stormed Emma Cartwright's general store. They claimed to be inspecting for safety violations, but their actions were little more than open intimidation. Emma, defiant as ever, refused to back down. "You want to find something?" she said, standing firm behind the counter. "Go ahead and look. You won't find anything illegal here." The men overturned shelves, scattering goods across the floor, but left empty-handed. As they walked out, one of them leaned close to Emma and whispered, "Next time, we won't be so polite." Emma reported the incident to James and Langley, her hands trembling with anger. "They think they can scare me into silence," she said, "but they've got another thing coming." James nodded. "That's exactly what they want, to scare you, to scare all of us. But as long as we hold the line, they'll lose." While the town braced for more confrontations, James was focused on leveraging their recent breakthrough. The evidence from the weapons shipment was enough to attract outside attention, but he knew they needed to present it carefully. If the Iron Crows caught wind of their plans, they'd try to shut it down before help could arrive. James called a meeting with Langley, Anna, Paul, and Sarah. "We need to get this file into the hands of someone who can act on it," James said, spreading the dossier across the diner's back table. "Someone at the state or federal level who isn't compromised." Langley frowned. "That's a short list." Anna, ever the strategist, spoke up. "What about Agent Carter from the state task force? You said he was clean when we vetted him." James nodded. "Carter's a good option, but we'll need to get the file to him in person. If we try sending it electronically, the Crows could intercept it." Paul leaned forward. "You're talking about sneaking this past their entire operation. How do we pull that off?" James smirked. "We don't. We distract them instead." That night, the town went into action. While Langley's deputies staged increased patrols near the Iron Crow's depot, Sarah and Emma orchestrated a subtle but effective disinformation campaign. Using burner phones and anonymous tips, they fed the syndicate false leads about supposed raids and investigations, forcing the Iron Crows to spread their resources thin. Meanwhile, James and Anna prepared to deliver the dossier. They packed the evidence into a locked briefcase and planned a route to the state capitol that avoided major roads. As the sun set over the valley, James stood on his porch, his truck idling in the driveway. Anna approached, her expression resolute. "Ready?" she asked. James nodded. "Let's move." The drive to the state capitol was tense. James took back roads and avoided any intersections where they might encounter Iron Crow's patrols. The night air was thick with tension, every shadow along the route a potential threat. As they neared the halfway point, a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. The vehicle followed them for several miles, maintaining a steady distance. "They're on to us," Anna said, her voice tight. James nodded, gripping the wheel. "Hold on." He took a sudden turn onto an unmarked dirt road, the truck bouncing as it sped through the forest. The pursuing vehicle followed, its headlights growing brighter as it gained ground. James veered sharply, skidding onto a narrow path that led to an old logging bridge. As they crossed, he jammed the brakes and turned the truck sideways, blocking the bridge. "Out!" James barked. Anna scrambled out of the passenger seat, clutching the briefcase. They sprinted into the woods as the pursuing vehicle screeched to a halt. "Find them!" a voice shouted, followed by the sound of men crashing through the underbrush. James and Anna moved quickly but quietly, weaving through the trees until they reached a small creek. They waded downstream, the cold water masking their trail. After what felt like hours, they emerged near an abandoned cabin James had scouted earlier. They slipped inside and waited, their breaths shallow as they listened for the sound of pursuit. The forest was silent. "I think we lost them," Anna whispered. James nodded. "Let's keep it that way." The next morning, they reached the state capitol and met Agent Carter in a secure location. The agent, a tall man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the dossier carefully. "This is damning," Carter said, his voice low. "If this checks out, and I believe it will, it's enough to shut them down." James leaned forward. "Then you'd better move fast. They're on to us, and they won't hesitate to escalate." Carter nodded. "We'll act quickly, but I need to coordinate with my team. This level of operation requires precision." As Carter left with the briefcase, Anna turned to James. "Do you think it'll be enough?" James's gaze was steely. "It has to be." Back in Maple Creek, the tension reached a boiling point. The Iron Crows, realizing they'd been misled, retaliated by increasing their intimidation tactics. Guards patrolled the streets openly, and unmarked vehicles loomed near critical town locations. But the townspeople, galvanized by James's leadership, stood their ground. Sheriff Langley and his deputies maintained a visible presence, while Sarah and Emma continued to rally the community. "They're waiting for something," Paul said during a meeting at the diner. "Maybe they know what we sent." "Let them wait," James replied. "The longer they sit on edge, the more mistakes they'll make." 2 days later, the town's patience paid off. Helicopters thundered over the valley as state and federal agents descended on the Iron Crow's depot. The raid was swift and overwhelming, agents storming the site and seizing weapons, drugs, and documents. From his vantage point on the ridge, James watched as the Iron Crows were taken into custody. Their leader, Carter Gage, was led away in handcuffs, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "It's over," Anna said, standing beside him. James shook his head. "Not yet. This was just one piece of their operation. There's still more to uncover." Anna placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll keep fighting." As the sun set over Maple Creek, James allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. They had won a significant battle, but the war against the Iron Crows, and the corruption they represented, was far from over. The reckoning had begun. In the days following the raid, Maple Creek felt a cautious relief. The Iron Crows depot had been dismantled, their leaders taken into custody, and much of their contraband confiscated. For the first time in months, the townspeople began to believe that life might return to normal. But James Westwood knew better. Sitting on his porch one evening, James studied the notes Anna had compiled from the raid's aftermath. State and federal agents had uncovered connections to other syndicates, evidence of broader networks operating in the region. The Iron Crows were only one piece of a much larger puzzle. "They didn't build this operation alone," James muttered to himself, flipping through the pages of financial records and coded communications. The creak of the gate drew his attention. Sheriff Langley approached, his hat tilted low, his face grim. "You've seen the reports, I assume?" Langley said, settling into the chair across from James. James nodded. "This goes deeper than we thought. The Iron Crows were just a branch, a testing ground for something bigger." Langley leaned back, exhaling slowly. "The feds think the same. Agent Carter reached out this morning. He says the evidence points to a coordinated network spanning several states. They're calling it the Gray Hand." James's jaw tightened. He had heard whispers of the Gray Hand during his years as an investigator, a shadowy syndicate known for operating with precision and ruthlessness. "They won't let this slide," James said. "We've embarrassed them, and they'll want to make an example of us." That night, Maple Creek experienced the first sign of retaliation. Emma Cartwright's general store, which had become a hub for resistance efforts, was broken into. Shelves were emptied, files destroyed, and her inventory ruined. The attack was brutal, meant not just to disrupt but to send a message. James arrived early the next morning to survey the damage. Emma stood by the shattered front window, her arms crossed, her eyes blazing with defiance. "They think this'll stop us," Emma said as James approached. "They're wrong." James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll rebuild. But this confirms it. They're still watching us." Over the next few days, the town's uneasy calm was shattered by more incidents. Sarah Whitaker received a call in the middle of the night. A low, menacing voice warning her to close the diner or face the consequences. Sheriff Langley's patrol car was rammed off the road by an unmarked truck, forcing him to call in reinforcements from the state police. Even James wasn't spared. One evening, as he returned to his ranch, he found a dead animal hanging from his front gate, a chilling warning that his efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. Anna Harper was the one who voiced what everyone was thinking. "They're trying to break us," she said during a meeting at the diner. "One by one, they're isolating us, trying to make us feel like we're alone." James shook his head. "They're underestimating us again. If we stay united, they won't win." James knew the town couldn't remain on the defensive. The Gray Hand was a sophisticated organization, and Maple Creek needed to adapt quickly to counter their tactics. "We need to go on the offensive," James told Langley as they reviewed the latest reports. "If we can uncover more about their operations, we can expose them before they can strike again." Langley raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose we do that? We're not exactly equipped for covert operations." James smirked. "We don't have to be. They've already given us everything we need. They just don't realize it yet." Using the evidence gathered during the depot raid, James identified key locations tied to the Gray Hand: old warehouses, abandoned properties, and a string of shell companies that seemed to have no legitimate business purpose. "These are their supply lines," James explained during a meeting with Langley, Anna, Paul, and Emma. "If we can disrupt them, we'll force them to show their hand." The plan was simple but risky. Paul and Emma would focus on monitoring the roads, noting any unusual activity near the identified locations. Anna would coordinate with Langley and his deputies to discreetly increase patrols and gather information. James, meanwhile, would take a more direct approach. Late one night, he drove to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The building matched the description of a suspected Gray Hand facility. Armed with a flashlight and a small camera, James slipped inside, his movements silent and deliberate. The interior was empty, at first glance, but as James explored further, he discovered a hidden room behind a false wall. Inside, he found stacks of documents, crates labeled with cryptic codes, and a series of maps detailing distribution routes. James worked quickly, photographing everything before slipping out unnoticed. The evidence James uncovered painted a chilling picture. The Gray Hand was larger and more organized than he'd feared. They had supply routes spanning multiple states, connections to corrupt officials, and a sophisticated system for laundering money through seemingly legitimate businesses. "This is bigger than the Iron Crows ever were," James said during a meeting with Langley and Anna. "If we're going to stop them, we need more than just Maple Creek." Langley nodded. "I'll reach out to Carter. He'll know how to escalate this." As the town braced for the next wave of retaliation, James worked tirelessly to strengthen their defenses. More cameras were installed, additional patrols were organized, and townspeople were trained to recognize and report suspicious activity. But even as Maple Creek prepared, the Gray Hand struck again. This time, their target was Anna. Late one evening, as Anna locked up the schoolhouse, a group of masked men appeared. They cornered her, their intentions clear. "We warned you," one of them growled, stepping closer. Anna's heart raced, but before she could react, headlights flooded the scene. Sheriff Langley's patrol car skidded to a stop, and his deputies emerged, guns drawn. The masked men scattered into the night, leaving Anna shaken but unharmed. The attack on Anna was a turning point. The town's resolve, already strong, solidified into unbreakable determination. "They've made this personal," James said, his voice cold and measured. "They think they can silence us with fear. They're wrong." As the sun rose over Maple Creek, James stood on his porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The Gray Hand was relentless, but so was he. The town had endured the Iron Crows, and now they faced an even greater challenge. James tightened his grip on the camera in his hand. The shadows were closing in, but Maple Creek had something the Gray Hand would never understand. A community united by a shared purpose, willing to fight for their home and their future. The reckoning wasn't over. It had only just begun. The morning after the Gray Hand's retreat, Maple Creek awoke to a cautious sense of relief. Federal agents remained stationed in the valley, ensuring the captured convoy was processed securely, but the townspeople knew better than to think the fight was entirely over. James Westwood had spent the night poring over the evidence seized from the trucks. The files and crates revealed the Greyhound's sprawling network, money laundering schemes, connections to corrupt officials, and plans for expanding operations into neighboring regions. "It's worse than we thought," James said during a meeting at Sarah's diner, spreading the documents across the table. This wasn't just a stronghold. Maple Creek was meant to be the linchpin for their entire regional expansion. Langley leaned back in his chair, his face grim. They wanted to control the whole valley, maybe even beyond. Anna, sitting beside him, pointed to a series of coded messages in the documents. "These are instructions to their operatives. They were gearing up for something big, something we've only delayed." James nodded. "That's why we have to finish what we started. The Greyhound may be in retreat, but if we let them regroup, they'll come back stronger." For the next week, the town remained on high alert. Federal agents worked closely with Langley and his deputies to secure the valley. Surveillance was expanded, patrols doubled, and the evidence collected was sent to Washington for deeper analysis. Meanwhile, James and Anna focused on unraveling the codes in the documents. Late one evening, Anna cracked a crucial piece of the puzzle. "These locations," she said, pointing to a map spread across James's desk. "They're storage facilities likely used to house weapons, money, and records. If we take these out, we cripple their ability to recover." James studied the map, his expression calculating. "Then we move fast. We coordinate with Carter and hit them before they know what's happening." The operation was set for 3 days later. Agent Carter assembled a multi-agency task force, with support from state police and specialized units. The plan was precise: simultaneous raids on 4 key facilities linked to the Greyhound. On the morning of the raids, Maple Creek gathered in the town square. Federal agents briefed the townspeople on what to expect, emphasizing the importance of staying vigilant. "This is the last push," James told the crowd. "If we succeed today, the Greyhound loses its foothold in the region. But we can't let our guard down. Stay strong. Stay united." The townspeople nodded, their determination evident. The raids began at dawn. The first target, a storage facility in the neighboring town of Hilltop, was taken swiftly. Agents recovered crates of illegal weapons and forged documents tying the Greyhound to high-level officials. The second location, a secluded cabin deep in the woods, proved more challenging. As agents approached, they came under fire from armed operatives. A tense standoff ensued, but after several hours, the operatives surrendered, and the site was secured. The third and fourth targets were warehouses on the outskirts of a nearby industrial park. These locations yielded the most significant discoveries: ledgers detailing bribes paid to local and state officials, blueprints for expansion, and encrypted devices believed to contain the organization's financial records. As the task force worked to secure the evidence, Maple Creek remained vigilant. Langley and his deputies patrolled the town, ensuring no Greyhound operatives tried to retaliate. At the diner, Sarah coordinated efforts to keep the townspeople informed and calm. Emma and Paul worked alongside her, ensuring supplies were distributed and families remained safe. "This is what they don't understand," Emma said, handing Paul a box of provisions. "They can attack our buildings, threaten our businesses, but they'll never break our spirit." Paul smiled. "That's because we don't just live here. We protect each other." As evening fell, James received a call from Agent Carter. "It's done," Carter said. "We've secured all 4 sites. The evidence is overwhelming, enough to dismantle the Greyhound's operations in this region and beyond." James exhaled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "And their leadership?" "We've identified several high-ranking members," Carter replied. "Warrants are being issued as we speak. They won't be able to hide for long." James hung up and stepped onto his porch. The valley was quiet, bathed in the golden light of sunset. For the first time in months, it felt like peace was truly within reach. That night, the town gathered at the schoolhouse for a celebration. It was a modest affair: homemade dishes, shared stories, and music played on an old record player. James stood at the back of the room, watching as the townspeople laughed and danced. Anna approached, holding 2 cups of punch. "You should be proud," she said, handing him a cup. "This town is stronger because of you." James shook his head. "They were always strong. They just needed a reminder of what they're capable of. Anna smiled. Still, they wouldn't be here without you. James raised his cup. Here's to them, and to keeping this valley safe. In the weeks that followed, the Gray Hands network continued to unravel. Arrests were made across multiple states, and the evidence seized during the raids led to the indictment of several high-profile figures. Maple Creek, once a target for corruption and exploitation, became a symbol of resilience. Journalists flocked to the town, eager to tell the story of how a small community stood against a powerful syndicate and won. For James, the work was far from over. He knew that other threats would arise, other organizations would try to fill the void left by the Gray Hand. But he also knew that Maple Creek was ready. Standing on the ridge one evening, James looked out over the valley. The lights of the town twinkled below, a testament to the strength and unity of its people. Langley joined him, a thermos of coffee in hand. "What now?" the sheriff asked. James smiled faintly. "Now we keep watching, keep preparing. There's always another fight, but this town knows how to handle it." Langley nodded. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to all of us," James corrected. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Maple Creek stood as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, unity and determination could prevail. The storm had passed, but the lessons learned and the bonds forged ensured the town would never face it alone again. The light had prevailed, and Maple Creek's story would inspire others to stand strong, fight back, and protect what mattered most.